Welcome to Context. This is Brad Harris. Today, I'm speaking with Jennifer Ratner-Rosenhagen, a historian who specializes in researching and writing about the history of ideas and their consequences. Jennifer is a gifted thinker who has a unique ability to connect huge numbers of dots on very complicated subjects, and it would be hard to find a scholar better equipped to enhance our historical perspective on how we decide what's true, which is what we spend most of this conversation digging into. Jennifer has published some great books I highly recommend on the history of culture and philosophy, including American Nietzsche and The Ideas That Made America, which I'll provide links to in the show notes. She currently teaches at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Now, for those of you who support this podcast, you've probably already heard my first conversation with Jennifer, which I published recently as a bonus episode on my Patreon page. And given how well that went and how much Jennifer and I still had left to talk about, we decided to present part 2 of our conversation here to everyone. If you like this episode and you want to hear part 1, again, you can find that on my Patreon feed, which is patreon.com/context. You can also head to my website, bradharris.com, to find other ways to support the show and learn more. Thanks to everyone who already supports the show for helping to ensure that this thing keeps going. And now for part 2 of my conversation with Jennifer Ratner-Rosenhagen. Jennifer Ratner-Rosenhagen, I'm so delighted you've come back to join me for a second conversation on context.
Thank you, Brad.
Most people haven't heard you and I talk yet. I did release our first conversation on my Patreon feed for people who support the show, and that was a fascinating conversation. And we touched on ideas that were so deep historically and philosophically that I wanted to bring you back in for a follow-up conversation, and I received lots of messages from listeners that they wanted to hear more from you. So I'd love for you to jump back in again here and introduce yourself to the general audience and give us a little bit of a background on what it is that you study as a historian.
Thank you so much, Brad. I'm thrilled to hit the reset on our conversation and to take it further. I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to this. So I do something called intellectual history, which also often when I say that gets the reaction where people kind of furrow their brows because it's not quite clear what that means. And what that means simply is that I am a historian. And when I look at American history, what I'm looking at, or listening for, I should say, is the ideas that were produced in the past. And so it's looking at the American past, not by way of, presidencies or wars, or economic policies, although that's not insignificant. But the main thing I'm listening for is how particular people at particular moments in time in American history understood themselves, understood their world, and how they articulated it at that particular time. And so for me, sometimes I like to say ecumenical, and sometimes I like to say promiscuous intellectually, because I'll look at anything from religion to the arts, to poetry, to literary movements, to philosophy. So I'm pretty expansive in terms of what I look at, what kinds of ideas I'm paying attention to. But first and foremost, my commitment is to trying to understand how people in the American past understood themselves, understood their world, and how those ideas actually had purchase in the world, that, had agency, shaped the development of American history.
Looking at the body of your work, it's pretty clear that you're spending a lot of your time articulating how ideas have consequences. That might seem like a pretty obvious statement, but traditionally in history, in the profession of history, a lot of historians focused on not the history of ideas so much as the history of big battles, of generals, of presidents, of people in power. Mm-hmm. But throughout your work, you seem to be trying to take a step back and observe historical forces that are even more fundamental than war or prominent individuals. You're looking at the ideas that underlie these events and that motivate these kinds of conflicts and these kinds of exertions of power. So a particular example would be the American Revolutionary War.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, we spend a lot of time learning about the Revolutionary War, the dates, the names. You spend more time focusing on the ideas that motivated those individuals and then actually compelled an entire population to assume this massive risk of taking up arms against the most powerful military in the world.
Well, the really absolutely reductive and simplistic answer to that is there was a reason why American patriots were fighting, right? There was an idea of what America could be or could not be under British rule. And so those were ideas that they were willing to not only die for, they were willing to kill for. And so those ideas, that vision of the possibility of an America liberated from, the imperial claim of Mother England, this has to be part of the story, right? This has to be part of our understanding of what drove these people to take up arms. I mean, it really was a totally crazy thing to do. As you said, the most powerful army on planet Earth. There was no reason from the outset for anyone to think that they were going to pull this off. But what fueled them, the passion, the vision, the fire, the fury, was the ideas that were operative at the time. And these are in many regards, Enlightenment ideals, which both served as a criticism of the imbalanced power relations that they had with England, but also, and I think even more importantly, what could come after, the kind of freedom and liberation that could come after the yoke of British oppression was thrown off.
Yeah, what's unique about America, and we hear it so much, it almost makes it easier to forget or discount. It's like it's become banal. But what is historically unique is that it was established based on a shared set of ideas, whereas practically every other society in history, every other nation, the boundaries around most other communities were always drawn based on a shared identity. What was supposed to bound America, at least in principle, was this shared set of ideas, as you write a lot about in your book, The Ideas That Made America, ideas that derived from the Enlightenment. So in particular, ideas about natural rights. Rather than organizing your society around a particular set of shared physical characteristics or a shared language. I mean, the historical exceptionalism of America's ability to have pulled this off, for the most part, for the last 250 years becomes very clear when you look at a much more common example that really ran away with itself during the 20th century in Germany, where this idea of the Volk, the shared Aryan characteristics uniting the German people, was so central to their entire notion of being a part of a nation, of being German. I mean, that is obviously an extreme case, but it points out the historical rule of how societies typically cohere around identity instead of ideas. But at least in principle, the opposite is true in America. And it seems like that has been what's made the history of the United States very inspiring, but also so turbulent and fractious. And that kind of turbulence ebbs and flows over our history, but I think today we are seeing a historical spike in the amount of turbulence, in the fractiousness between competing ideas of what it is to be an American and what America is supposed to represent. Well, obviously, we're not literally going to war with each other, but people are talking about a cold civil war that has spread across the land. What is your perspective on this history, and how do you see it influencing the present moment and the discourse we see today coming from everything from the White House to Google, Facebook, and Twitter? I mean, do you agree that the historical idea of American exceptionalism is relevant here?
Oh, absolutely. And I should commend you. I've never quite heard someone express it at least as an economical way as you just did, which is America founded on idea as opposed to other nation states founded on identity. And this is precisely the possibility and the beauty of American history, the subsequent history, but also, as you said, the fractious and perilous nature of it as well. So I think it's important to remember that there was very little shared identity among the American revolutionaries. If you look up and down the coast, these were people from, in many cases, different linguistic backgrounds, different religious backgrounds. Forget race and ethnicity, because obviously slaves and Native Americans were not part of the folk, were not considered part of the folk at that time, although come to be part of the folk as we move forward. But they had a shared grievance, and they also had a shared aspiration to, in the words of Thomas Paine, make the world anew, make the world over again. And it isn't really until, I would say, quite a number of decades after the American Revolution, after the founding of the American nation, do we have a widespread and concerted effort to create something like an American identity. What does it mean for us, a people of very different backgrounds, very different traditions, different tongues, to belong to one another, to be a people? And there's a very concerted effort at all levels of society to create something called America, as an idea, and as a culture and as a people. And I would say that this is something that we have inherited and still struggle with today. So this is, if there is a through line to American intellectual history, it is this very issue, the struggle of a pluralistic society to find what unites them, to find out what are those bonds of affiliation and affection that knit us together as a people, despite, or rather because of our great differences. And that's with us today. I mean, that's just in the DNA of American life. That's what it is to be an American, is to struggle to figure out what does it mean to be an American. And I think you're right that we can say that this is the abiding leitmotif of American intellectual life, but you're right. There are moments when it's hotter and there are moments when it's cooler. And I think you're exactly right. We're in one of those moments when the conversation is really, really alive, very vibrant, feels very consequential today.
Yeah. I wonder how natural it is for a diverse people to come together and enter into this kind of contract, because that's the basic logistics of what it is to be an American, to enter into a social contract that explicitly transcends the intuitional kind of instinctive communal bonds of shared identity and attaches to something more abstract that's based on this fundamental notion of natural rights and enlightened self-interest that came from John Locke and the Enlightenment, and that was built into the American Constitution. And how we balance personal liberty with social equality. I mean, this is a challenge that no other society has managed to pull off. And I think that's the reason why we call this the American experiment. Do you see this as an experiment that we could ever complete? I mean, obviously, the experiment could fail if America literally broke apart and states just peeled off. But is there anything that would indicate to you that this experiment succeeded?
That is a very interesting question. I think, well, I mean, I'm a historian, so I can easily cop out of this. You know, we don't prognosticate. We're only good at looking backward. But if history is any indication, we're not going to settle this experiment anytime soon. And it's hard to imagine what those terms for a rapprochement, or what that settlement would even look like. But I think an earnestness and an openness and a sincerity to have this conversation over and over again is what makes the American experiment work, right? It may not make it settled once and for all. It may not be legislative that you can draw out of it, but it's terms for engagement that I think make America. That's what I think is what's the most beautiful and remarkable about America. If we can at least agree on some shared terms for the experiment, or for the conversation, use whatever metaphor you want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there has to be some kind of a shared basis in our notions of what's real, What's true? What's good? I mean, we all have to have a grip ultimately on the same reality. And this all kind of reverberates back to an ongoing theme on the show of what it means to be modern. What is postmodernism, and what do postmodernists reject about notions of objective truth, of objective reality? I mean, this postmodernist challenge to ideas about objective truth and ideas about objective good and universal human values really matters when you look at America and the American context. Because if we understand America, or any modern, secular, liberal democracy for that matter, in terms of a shared set of ideas rather than a shared identity, I think it's pretty critical that we all agree on some basic things that inform our ideas. For example, what a fact is, the status of a fact, or what is true. This idea that something can be true for you that isn't necessarily true for me, right? Your truth, I have my truth, versus just the truth. Now, there are plenty of examples of socially constructed truth or metaphorical truth, but not all truth is constructed. Some truths are discovered. For example, the Earth is not the center of the universe, or the truth that life evolves through natural selection, or that infectious disease spreads through contact with certain microorganisms, or that psychological well-being has a lot to do with the balance of neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine in the brain. These things are true whether or not humans are aware of them, and whether or not we've all decided to agree that something else is true. And part of what makes an idea a good idea, part of what helps us differentiate a good idea from a bad idea, I would argue, is the degree to which the idea helps humanity discover what's true. And so when we're talking about ideas that reach toward some universal truth about how the world works regardless of how humanity wants it to work or thinks it works, or ideas about what supports human well-being physiologically or emotionally, I wonder how important it is to fixate on the social construction of those ideas, of the historical contingency of those ideas, because those are precisely the kinds of ideas that help us to transcend that kind of social construction, to escape historical contingency.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I just want to get your reactions to a claim you made in your book, The Ideas That Made America, which was that the context of an idea is always as important as the idea itself. So just to take this back to Alan Bloom for a moment before I get your reaction, it seems like Alan Bloom was laboring throughout much of his book to argue that there are actually certain ideas that transcend context, or that should transcend context, and the ideas that qualify for that kind of universality are among humanity's best ideas, and what makes them such good ideas is their universality. Scientific ideas like the ones I laid out just a moment ago, those are sort of the low-hanging fruit here for categories of ideas with universal applicability. But it seemed to me that a lot of Bloom's argument was that in the humanities, we can discover a lot of ideas with that kind of universal applicability as well. And he went way beyond John Locke and Thomas Hobbes's ideas about enlightened self-interest and natural rights. As you know, he went into a full discussion of Rousseau's ideas about sensibility and the sort of passions that make life worth living, which seems to be very universal across cultures. This seems to be a human trait versus a cultural trait. He talked about Nietzsche's modern search for meaning and avoidance of nihilism. These seem to be universally uplifting and empowering ideas.
Yeah.
So how much does context matter for those kinds of ideas?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, so I think Alan Bloom is interesting on this because I think I don't want to say that he wants it both ways or talks out of both sides of his mouth on this, but within that text, The Closing of the American Mind, we see a sort of push me, pull you about the transcendence of ideas. So yes, one of the things he's arguing in the book is that the moves of the sort of culture wars, relativism, postmodernism has made a mockery of timeless truths, has made a mockery of the notion of the human, as something that that isn't only culturally constituted or the site of power, to use a Foucauldian term, that we've lost that sense of the beauty, coherence, grandeur of the human being. And we've gotten caught up in the perspectival and the contingent and the fractiousness and the subjectivity of human experience. And so we've lost that sense of a common conversation. We've lost that sense, right, of great text or great beauty. So there is that part of Bloom that is longing for something transcendent. But he also makes moves in that text which undermine that very argument that he makes. So one of them is, in the text, what he's concerned about is the influence of foreign ideas on American thought, and that Americans have no concept where those ideas came from. So they fetishize them, they worship them, they see them as cool because they're coming from Europe or whatever. Here, I think he's talking a lot about postmodernism, but he's also talking about earlier intellectual movements. He even at one point says, Americans are like barbarians worshiping ideas that they know nothing about. He says, quote, "We need a heightened awareness of where we must look if we are to understand what we are saying and thinking." So that's just one passage, but there are many more like that, where he says the provenance of an idea does matter. So if you're going to be reading, let's say, some great European philosopher, you need to know the context of those ideas to really understand. You can't just take the ideas and run with them. This is what he's accusing as the sort of banality or the openness, right, of the American mind, the utter openness, the indiscriminateness of American mind. So this is one of the criticisms that he have, is that Americans are ignorant of the contexts of so many of the ideas that they play with, worship, fetishize. And that means that they're essentially ignoramuses, right? Or pretentious ignoramuses, but they're not truly educated in the larger social, political, economic, spiritual fabric that created these thinkers and created these ideas. So, Brad, what is that? That's a call for context. So does it mean that the ideas don't have the power to feel transcendent? No, of course not. They can still feel transcendent. But he's making an argument there for immanence, for particularity, for time and place. So that is, I think that's the interesting tug in Bloom, and I actually think that's what makes him rich. So I don't think this is what makes his argument illegitimate. I think it's what gives it a richness and a tension to it.
Do you think a lot of his readers misunderstood that nuance?
Oh my God. Yes.
Well, there's a difference between understanding the context out of which ideas emerge. That historical sensitivity can enhance your understanding of the idea itself. But I don't think that implies that all ideas, let me think about how to put this.
Maybe you want to say, can I try this?
Yes.
That they can be reduced to their context. And I do think so first of all, yes, I think that you were channeling your own inner Alan Bloom when you were heading there. I think this is what Alan Bloom is the real grievance is. So in other words, I actually think Alan Bloom is very much historically minded, contextually minded. So for all the talk of the timeless beauty, of the magical works of art or timeless truth of important works of philosophy or literature, he's very historically minded in wanting to understand the larger world in which produced these texts and made them, have the power that they had. So he's not ahistorical at all. So already that's a claim for context right there. But I think what he is doing is to saying, however, context doesn't get the last word. So, for example, it is crucial that anyone, in my view, and again, I'm speaking as a historian, so I'm very biased here, I will admit that straight away, who wants to invoke natural rights for doing anything, for any kind of claim that one wants to make, it seems to me that it is important that that person understand that natural rights were produced out of an imperial context. It was part of the crisis of knowing that happened as European powers went into foreign lands and met people who, or they weren't even sure if they were people, right? Met other beings who didn't look like them, who didn't talk like them. And they felt intellectually, existentially destabilized. The Bible wasn't a great guide for making sense of this. And it is out of this context that you see the concerted effort, what we could now call the Enlightenment. And that is philosophers of all stripes trying to think about what are the core features of what it means to be human in light of the fact that we now recognize, thanks to our imperial projects, that what it means to be human is not what we used to think it was, or we need to restate that with a kind of clarity now that we realize that the world has what seem to be possibly human beings that are very, very different from us. So natural rights was born of this moment, was born of this crisis. A dismissive way of putting it is to say it was born of an anxiety. It doesn't have to be dismissive, but I think sometimes it is. So that natural rights is only an expression of, European anxiety about populations unlike themselves. And so they invent something called natural rights to figure out who's in and who's out, what they're endowed with, et cetera, et cetera. But that is simply to say, I don't think natural rights. Well, first of all, I think we need to have we'll have a conversation about whether, in fact, natural rights refers to something that is transcendently true. But that's beside the point. We can get to that. It doesn't matter. We still need to know what context created the possibility that human beings could even articulate this notion. So where I stand, I think where Alan Bloom stands is to say, even if you know that natural rights comes out of this crisis of confidence, if you will, or crisis of certainty that comes with the breaking open of the globe thanks to empire, does not necessarily mean that that's all it is.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about that a little more. I mean, it seems to me that the imperialism component of this is one among many other factors rather than being the prime mover of these developments. The Enlightenment's fixation on natural rights, on fleshing out this philosophy about natural rights and enlightened self-interest, to me seems like more of a product of Europe's own internal strife. At the beginning of the Enlightenment, Europe is just coming off of like 100 years of nonstop war that crescendoed with the 30 Years' War in the early 1600s that was responsible for like 30 million casualties. Most of these wars had to do with religious differences between Catholics and Protestants. So these are wars over the right ideas. And this is all occurring contemporaneously with the scientific revolution, when natural philosophers were showing that both sides had really bad ideas about how the world worked and what humanity's place within it really was. And to your point, you throw in the great age of oceanic exploration that began in the late 1400s and really picked up steam during the late 1500s. And all of these factors combine to just completely disrupt Europeans' confidence in their worldview and, importantly, in their relationship to authority. Authorities of knowledge, authorities of belief, and authorities of government, authorities of social organization. So this is the context in which some of Europe's brightest thinkers start to really take a step back and completely reimagine the social contract. And the impression that I've always gotten is that the real heart of Europeans' existential crisis that motivated the Enlightenment came not so much from their imperialistic endeavors, but from all of the religious barbarism that they were witnessing all around them and this sort of unresolvable, incompatible claims to truth that were being offered by Protestants and Catholics. Their awareness of foreign peoples, of Native Americans, for example, just added fuel to this already raging fire.
Okay, but so you're actually, I agree with you. I was being monocausal here, just for the sake of clarity of trying to explain the importance of understanding a larger context. But you're right, we can even complicate it. So let's isolate those three things that you pointed out. One is the internal religious wars within Europe, or religious contestation. What was the second thing?
I mentioned the scientific revolution, but I agree with you. I think global exploration was a key part of this.
Okay, sure, absolutely. And I don't think without these three things, we don't get the idea of natural rights, right? Because obviously the Enlightenment is building on the ideas of the scientific revolution. And if that doesn't predate it, you can't get to the Enlightenment without it. Okay. And so would you say, I'm curious what you would say, that in those contexts, something like natural rights was discovered, or that natural rights was created, the idea of natural rights?
I think the predominant heritage of ideas about natural rights do originate with the era of global exploration and the scientific revolution. Those are the parents of the philosophical child that would grow into the Enlightenment. What nourishes the Enlightenment, so sticking with the analogy, what sort of nourishes the growth of that philosophical child, I think were the religious wars of the 1600s. I think it starts with the era of global exploration and the scientific revolution, because these two forces, one from abroad and one at home, converge to sort of force Europeans to acknowledge that their worldview might be wrong, or at least that there are radically different worldviews on offer, radically different ways of understanding how the world works, and radically different cultural prescriptions for how to live in it. So the doubt is already in place. The cracks in Europeans' worldview are already beginning to show just by virtue of exposure to alternative worldviews, and then just barraging that edifice of meaning and moral authority is the ceaseless religious violence that erupts across Europe during the 1600s. Nothing like the violence of the 30 Years' War, the trauma of the 30 Years' War occurred at all throughout European history besides the world wars of the 20th century. This was just devastating. And I think that this is the nail in the coffin that drives many European thinkers to really realize it's time to wipe the slate clean and try to discover ideas about human well-being that are more universal and less contingent upon your religious sect or what king sits on the throne, etc. It was very pragmatic of the Europeans to try to do this, just sign the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 and just say, we have got to stop fighting each other. There's no end in sight to any of this. 30 million dead is more than enough. And what was it all for? We're killing each other over variations in how we understand the world. And in the meantime, the leaders of the scientific revolution are telling us that we've all been wrong this entire time, using new experimental and mathematical methods to investigate the natural world was producing this cascade of discoveries about how the world actually worked. And I don't think it was a huge conceptual leap to imagine turning those same methods of rational inquiry on humanity, and notions of self-interest and natural rights seem like these boilerplate starting points for rationally discoverable universal truths about human disposition and about relationships between individuals and authority. This was what Locke was trying to do. I mean, John Locke's theory of enlightened self-interest was based on the idea of stripping away all of the historically contingent sources of authority. Strip away kings and queens and culture. And what are you left with? You're left with just natural human instincts that constrain behavior. So if you want to create a universal system of morals and social organization, the idea here is to just leverage those natural human instincts rather than some arbitrary external power.
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think you used a word that I think is very striking here, which was that there was a degree that there was a pragmatic move towards natural rights and other Enlightenment ideas because it worked, right? It worked to find some common ground. It worked to find some kind of harmony. It worked to set new terms for engagement rather than warfare. So they were useful. They were useful ideas. And I do believe that you're right, that at the time, the Locks, the Humes, the Rousseaus were trying very much to tap into what was most fundamental and basic, i.e. what was most natural, like get rid of all of every other thing, what is most natural and base to what it means to be a human being, and therefore what's possible for creating in human societies. We're all on the same page here. what we have through years of enlightened inquiry, enlightened investigation, and by that I mean throughout the 19th century, into the 20th century, and into the late 20th century, where we have postmodernism and the other isms that Bloom is taking issue with, is starting to question what was it they meant by natural, and why did they think certain things were natural and other things were artificial? What were the conditions of intellectual production whereby a Locke would make claims about what was natural versus what wasn't natural? And if you understand the terms of that intellectual production, you realize that he maybe has a partial or incomplete view of what natural means. So that is to say, so much of what I think Bloom was taking issue with, and I think many critics still take issue with, is the moves to, if you will, interrogate or question, or if you want to be uncharitable, say undermine the universality of those claims in order to just explode them, to just get rid of them, or to be reductive about it. They're the product of this context. It's not our context, therefore they're not relevant. But I would think that and that's a good caricature of, I think, some of the most slack and lazy thinkers, right? But I think that there are plenty of thinkers from, after Locke moving forward, and then even up until the time that Bloom is writing in our own day, that said, wait a second, those ideas were partial and incomplete. They were founded on some problematic institutions or biases. They're still worthy, but we need to resituate them differently, or we need to think more critically about how we make arguments for universality or what is natural. Does that? I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. But I think that in the same manner that we now talk about America in terms of the American experiment, because we acknowledge it's kind of an unending project of seeking a more perfect union by better aligning practice with principle, I think the Enlightenment was the same. The Enlightenment itself was an experiment in using reason to organize human society. So the way I imagine, people like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes were thinking about this is to start this experiment from the most basic and therefore universal human traits. And at a certain point, it just becomes completely counterproductive to challenge these universal human traits. And doing so just seems like it devolves more into a semantic squabble than an actual philosophical argument. So, for example, one of these basic universal human traits is the instinct, let alone the desire, to live and to avoid death. Survival is essential to human well-being. And as soon as you start arguing that survival isn't necessarily essential to human well-being, then your notion of human well-being is not universal. It's highly particular and peculiar. So self-interest is grounded in that most basic truth of human well-being, the desire to not die. More generally, in the interest of avoiding suffering. So enlightened self-interest starts there. Most of Thomas Hobbes's argument for how and why individuals should submit to authority that he wrote about in his book Leviathan was based on the universal human desire to avoid lives that were nasty, brutish, and short.
By the way, do you know what did he have in mind when he said life is brutish, nasty, and short?
Yeah, he was talking about the Native Americans who lived without the modern trappings of civilization and governmental power.
Yeah. In other words, I'm just saying the context of that claim is important to know.
But I think it's still relevant here. I mean, the basic idea is he might have been wrong. I think his argument was very misguided. But basically, all he was saying is that in the absence of any kind of civil authority to which humans can submit, life is nasty, brutish, and short. And he was using Native Americans as his archetype for this. I think he was wrong. He was ignorant to a lot of his claims. He'd never been to North America. But I think philosophically, he was just making the point that we all want to avoid death and chaos. And therefore, it's in our self-interest to organize ourselves into some kind of a society. Humans are social creatures. And if we're no longer going to submit to the authority of theocrats, what's our alternative? Well, if you look at Native Americans and how they're living, at least so far as he could tell, they were living in a kind of anarchy, a state of chaos. So Leviathan boils down to an argument for authority of some kind. Some authority is better than anarchy.
Absolutely. But the question is, was it true? And I'm not sure that he's right about human nature. I beg to differ. So yes, it was productive. Yes, it was pragmatic. Yes, it was a useful idea. But was it true? I mean, that's what I hear you still trying to figure out how we can cut through some of this chatter and just get to some fundamental agreements about what is true. And I would not necessarily classify that claim as true. And I think I would be in good company with many others who would want to beg to differ.
What is it that isn't true? So I just want to make sure I understand what you're challenging or what you're questioning as true. Is it his claim that Native Americans' lives are nasty, brutish, and short, or?
No. We're both in agreement that is false, or that was false. He didn't know much about Native Americans, so it wasn't no matter what, it wasn't a very informed comment, but that human life without, government is going to be nasty, brutish, and short. It depends on what he means by government. So yes, some kind of agreed upon terms of engagement, some kind of social contract, some kind of a sense of authority and organization. I would agree with that. Was it the one that he had in mind? What it needed to look like to not be brutish and short? I'm not sure I would agree with that today.
No, I'm there with you, absolutely. So I didn't mean to say that I agreed with Hobbes' idea of government. I think Hobbes had a very...
We got Brad to admit.
Yeah. I think we'd all be in trouble if Hobbes were in charge. I mean, he had an idea of government that was extremely repressive, and a lot of his ideas of government boiled down to kind of thought police, how you manage people's beliefs deep down, their experience of reality, all needed to point in the same direction as far as Hobbes was concerned in order to avoid chaos and the kind of theological conflict of the previous century. So totally with you there. I was just talking about his effort to at least acknowledge that human beings seek to organize themselves in some kind of a way to avoid death, carnage, and rule by the strong.
Yeah, no, I agree. To me, that's a very uncontroversial claim,
Okay.
But it doesn't tell you anything about how to live.
That's true.
Here's what I might tuck in here, if it's helpful or interesting. Hearing you talk is very clarifying for me because it helps remind me of why I'm attracted to the thinkers that I'm attracted to. And they're the kinds that crop up again and again in American life because they have to confront the same problem, right? The problem of American pluralism, the problem of American diversity, and how can we agree to live together with one another, recognizing that diversity? And this was the problem 200 years ago, and it's a problem that remains with us today. And the thinkers that I think are very compelling, I'm certainly drawn to them, but I find that they're ones that also really speak to my undergraduates, are the ones who say, we're not trying to make everybody alike. We're not trying to say that there are foundational, absolute, timeless truths to which we all must subscribe if we are not going to gouge each other's eyes out, but rather to say we recognize the difference of perspective, difference of affiliation, difference of affect is built in to what it means to be human in America, whether it's 1776 or 1876 or 1976. And yet still, we have to find a way to get along. We have to find a way to build that society so that our life is not nasty, brutish, and short. So that is to say, we need to find ways to overcome difference. So not insist on foundational universality, but rather overcome something which we think might be foundational, which is to say nothing is particularly foundational to what it means to be human in America at any particular time. But we can agree to what are some provisional truths, or some pragmatic truths, or some useful fictions that we can all agree to so that we can live happy, healthy, wholesome lives with one another. So that is to say, I think the thinkers, Hobbes in that regard is a foundationalist. He's starting from certain first principles and he's working out from there. I think what America has produced over the last 200 years, by virtue of it being this diverse society, is thinkers who said, well, let's not try to insist on first principles because we're not totally sure they exist. Every time we invent them, someone comes along to show us why we're wrong. So why not start from a place of first principles, but start right? So not start from origins, not start from a prioris, but work towards outcomes. Where is it we want to land? Where is it we can find agreement? And that is transactional, it's provisional, it's perspectival. I mean, use whatever word you want. It is not permanent. And yet it is still a quest for unity, right? It's still a quest for some collective sense of the good life. It is still a quest for society and not just atomistic individualism. Anyway, I think those are the thinkers, because then the arguments don't have to be who's right or who's wrong, but rather, how can we make this work, even if we're not in agreement about right and wrong, truth and falsehood, beauty and ugliness, et cetera, et cetera. And these are, like I said, the sort of caricatured thinkers, or the sort of sometimes sillier thinkers that Alan Bloom sort of swatted away. He could do so effortlessly because they weren't committed still to a unified project. I think his book does not hold as well when you look at thinkers like, I don't even know where to begin. I mean, it's such a large group of people, but someone like a Richard Rorty, who was out and about and working his neo-pragmatism at the very same time that Bloom is writing, The Closing of the American Mind. I could go on. Wayne Booth, I want to say he maybe passed away 10 years ago, but he was a beautiful thinker who worked a lot towards the end of his life at thinking about what would a humanism look like without universalism. So he's a wonderful piece on how is it we can think about human rights after deconstruction. Like if we take the assumptions of deconstructive theory to be true, or to be helpful, or to be somehow effective, how is it you can have a commitment to something like universal rights? And so he does a very interesting move and a very humanistic move about how you can have human rights without universals. So those are the kinds of, and then we can go earlier. William James, an early pragmatist in the late 19th, early 20th century, is exactly one of those thinkers. What would it mean to envision something like a humane collective life when we recognize that we cannot agree on our truths? And we should stop insisting on trying to get agreement with our truths, because that is what leads, in his view, to war. It is that insistence that we've all got to agree on the a prioris is what gets us into troubles. What would it look like if we would figure out a way to live humanely with one another, even when we don't agree? And I just think that's, I would go back. I would say Emerson in the early to mid 19th century, that this was Emerson's intellectual project as well. So that is to say, it is kind of an ongoing leitmotif in American thought about thinkers wrestling with our diversity, our difference, our pluralism, but recognizing that that's not an end point. You still need to figure out the rules for how you're going to set up a humane and functioning society. So that means you need something like buy-in to some sort of collective agreement, or what Richard Rorty called intersubjectivity, as opposed to objective truth. So Rorty had an idea you could build a society on intersubjectivity rather than objective truth, and it might be a better one and a more humane one, and one that leaves room for more beauty and human grandeur. So anyways, that is something that's been an abiding interest of mine as I've looked at and tried to listen to what are some of the innovations in American thought, the interesting contributions to the larger conversation of mankind that is particular, it's not exclusive to America, but it is something particular to America, which is how you build unity out of difference.
I'd love for us to take a step back, actually, because I haven't gone into pragmatism much on the show. And so if you don't mind, are you able to give a sort of synopsis of the history of pragmatism? You just went through some of the prominent writers in pragmatism, Richard Rorty, John Dewey. But if you don't mind, just reiterate for us, when does pragmatism start? What are some of its basic claims?
Okay, wonderful. Let's see if I can do justice to pragmatism. I better. I've been teaching it for 15 years now, and I devote whole sections of my writing to it. So let's see if I can give you pragmatism in a nutshell. I think, for starters, it's helpful to think about where pragmatism comes from. So pragmatism is considered an American philosophy. It comes out of American thinkers in the late 19th century. Some would say it is the only great contribution of American philosophy to the larger sweep of Western philosophy, that all the other isms are coming from Europe or coming from elsewhere, but the real intervention or innovation in philosophy to the contribution of world philosophy is American pragmatism, which starts getting traction in the late 19th century. And its heyday is sort of the turn of the last century, early 20th century, but then is so influential that even when pragmatism as a philosophy becomes less fashionable, so many of its ideas are worked into American education, American law, et cetera, et cetera. Pragmatism comes out of Darwinism. What Darwin and evolutionary theory helped people to see or understand or recognize is that things are always changing, that nothing on planet Earth is static and fixed and final form, but things are always evolving. And his great contribution to evolutionary theory was his idea about natural selection. Okay, we don't have to go into that right now. So what happens after Darwin is that more and more thinkers are starting to think about a world in transition, a world in which things change over time, a world in which things are in flux, a world in which the concept of what it means to be a human being isn't so much human being, but human becoming, right? Because we're changing, we're evolving over time. We're gaining new, we're strengthening the traits that work and we're losing the traits that don't work. And so what would it look like to have a philosophy that is cognizant of this, right? So a philosophy that stops trying to assert fixed and final truths, stops trying to assert absolutes, because if we really make a move with Darwin and evolutionary thought, we don't believe in that anymore. Things are ever developing, ever becoming, ever in flux, and therefore so should our concept of truth, and so should the way that we arrive at truth. And so pragmatism, the early major names are Charles Sanders Peirce, William James is hugely important, and just a lyrical writer and a magical thinker. I would really recommend, we can talk more about specific texts I might recommend. John Dewey is a little bit younger. He's a generation younger, but he's the one who really brings pragmatism into other arenas of American thought and institutions in the 20th century. And they're all a little different, but all of them are trying to look at truth, trying to move a concept of truth away from origins, where they come from. So this is true because the Bible says it's true, or this is true because my pastor says it's true, or this is true because John Locke says it's true. The origins of an idea for pragmatists is not so important. What's important for a pragmatist is where those ideas take us, the consequences of those ideas, how those ideas work in the world. And what the pragmatists argue is that we have a hard time agreeing what is true because we all have different traditions that we're drawing on. But we can have a much easier time agreeing what works, what ideas are working. And so that, again, that's a consequentialist view. That's literally a pragmatic view of truth. So, James says to this, truth happens to an idea is one of his famous quotes. So something is true because it proves itself to be true in the world. Something that is true, it gains its authority because it's efficacious. It doesn't come with authority. No ideas come from the outset with any authority. They have to achieve it in lived practice. And what that also opened up was the notion that something could be true now, but it might not be true again in the future, because in the future, that idea may no longer be efficacious, right? It may not quite have what James called the cash value that it does for us today. And so what that should do is to make us all experimentalists, make us all open-minded. You were all practitioners then in the creation and deployment of truth. And what we need to do is be ever vigilant to test and reformulate our truths ever and ever again, because we live in an evolutionary world. We live in a post-Darwinian world, a world ever in flux. And therefore, what was once true may not continue to be true. And what it means then to live in society is to be open to practicing, testing, reformulating truth. That's how I would put pragmatism in a nutshell. I'm happy, but I'm going to cut myself off here.
So that's helpful. So there's different truths, different categories of truth. The kinds of truth that pragmatists like James, Dewey, and Rorty are talking about here seem to fall into the category of social truth. So it's true that $1 buys you a cheap cup of coffee today. 30 years from now, that might no longer be true. So the value of $1 is a social truth. Outside of the social context that verifies the value of $1 is meaningless. It's valueless. The true value of $1 emerges only by virtue of us all agreeing on what it is. So that's a socially constructed truth, and that's great. That's one of many social technologies that we find extremely useful and extremely pragmatic. And going back to the pragmatists, I can understand how liberating it must have felt in the context of kind of being suffocated by traditional impositions of universal truth. So, for example, when Darwinian evolution comes along, I can just imagine the appeal of pragmatism explicitly offering what looked like more adaptable truth claims. I can just imagine young John Dewey sitting around a campfire, after a glass or two of whiskey, thinking about, oh my goodness, there is no timeless stability. Humanity is always changing. Our ideas about the world should always be changing too. I get that. But I think perhaps he overlooked the fact that the rules of evolution were still timeless. So the conditions for evolutionary change themselves were stable. The whole framework of forces and physical laws governing reality and giving rise to evolution, those are timeless. And if they weren't, we never would have been able to discover evolution in the first place. So evolution provides a perfect example of the difference between the category of scientific truth, these objective, universal truths about how the natural world works that are discoverable, and pragmatic social truths that are culturally mediated agreements. They're more like social technologies.
Except that you can be a very casual observer of the history of science, and that notion of what is objectively true in the material or natural world has changed over time, dramatically.
Yes, our understanding of the natural world has changed dramatically because we've made dramatic progress in our understanding of how the world works. And the postmodern rejection of that idea, this counter argument that we're not really making any kind of scientific progress, we're not really moving toward any objective truth about the world, and rather we're sort of shuffling between competing and incommensurable scientific paradigms. This came out of Thomas Kuhn's work from 1962, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. But nobody lamented that radical and radically misguided interpretation of his work more than Thomas Kuhn himself.
No, but I agree. And there was plenty of mockery of it. Philosophers who leaned in and heard 37 different ways in which he used the word paradigm. I mean, the text was, sliced and diced in every which way. And he regretted, as you said, the way in which some ran with it to say that it was a license for utter relativism. But he did unmistakably demonstrate, certainly to many people's satisfaction and mine, the ways in which what it constitutes truth in science is what scientific communities agreed to, and that is to say that there's a one-to-one correspondence to what the world is to be totally ignorant of the way that history flows. So it's not to say that it's absolutely based on illusion, but he did say it is what experts agree to call it at any particular time, and that when that agreement breaks down, right? That's when you have the introduction of a new paradigm. That's where you get the scientific revolutions, and that the ways of understanding of one group as you move forward, or one paradigm, do not necessarily translate to the next. And so what he did do unmistakably is to also say that scientific investigation was not a story of progress. This isn't about us getting ever closer and closer and closer to some absolute reality. And in that regard, he was making a claim about the relativism of science, not that can't be efficacious. Anyway, I think he was taking issue with those who took it as some sort of, extreme relativism bordering on a kind of nihilism. But there are some clear things in that text, and which he abided by long after, which I am yet to encounter scientists. This is not my beat, so I'm sure there's some robust argument that I'm not aware of.
Yeah, I think the part of his argument about how successive scientific paradigms tend to be incommensurable, so mutually incompatible, was the thing that really gripped people's imagination and caused them to reimagine the history of science not as one of linear progression closer and closer to the truth about how the world works, but more of a history of jumping between different views of the world that didn't build upon one another at all, and instead just reflected the needs of the scientists themselves to solve whatever particular puzzles they happen to be working on, which ends up making science look like a much more pragmatic enterprise, and one that lends itself to pragmatists like Richard Rorty's more general interpretation of intersubjectivity as the basis for truth. So I think all that the pragmatists are doing and all the postmodernists are doing, especially after reading Kuhn, is attempting to just collapse the category of scientific truth back into a broader category of socially constructed truth.
Yeah. For your listeners, I should just add, I don't mean to be, I have a citational mind. So whenever, we touch on a subject, I think about a text that people might read. But if you don't mind, let me just suggest to your reader or your listeners that if they're at all interested in, so Richard Rorty was a late 20th century or mid to late 20th century, what he called neo-pragmatist. So he's drawing on Dewey, drawing on James, but really bringing it up to speed with late, developments in mid to late 20th century thought. One of the texts that's most influential for Rorty is, in fact, as you're right, Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And what Rorty does is to say, look, Kuhn, and again, you could argue with the exact, accuracy or precision of Rorty's reading of his text, but that Rorty looks to Kuhn and says, look, Kuhn is showing us that even science and the practice of science and scientific investigation isn't even as scientific as we take it to be. And so he calls us we fuzzies, right? We humanistic thinkers, or social scientific thinkers should stop trying to emulate science, should stop fetishizing objectivity as the goal of their intellectual and ethical and aesthetic enterprises, because even in the sciences, it's not, we're seeing things are not as objective. So basically the way to look at a Rorty is that he's a pragmatist not only after Darwin, right, but after Thomas Kuhn. And so Rorty's whole neo-pragmatism is to do much more to break down science as a model of how humanistic thinkers, and that is to say, whether you're thinking about political theory or ethics or aesthetics, should not be modeling themselves on the sciences, but rather take the subjectivity, the relativism, the perspectivalism, the particularism that comes out of what we've learned from Thomas Kuhn, and instead of run from it, embrace it, but still try to imagine what does that civil society look like. And the text that I have in mind for your listeners is a text, I believe it's 1986, and it's called Science as Solidarity. And it's just a very economical articulation of what he means, what pragmatism, how he uses Kuhn, and how he makes this move of what a pragmatic, ethical, or political theory might look like and practice might look like when science no longer, or when we're striving as intellectuals to not strive towards what he calls objectivity, but rather strive towards something which he refers to as solidarity. That solidarity is the goal and not objectivity. And that's where the intersubjective nature of it comes in, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a text that's a very accessible statement of what that post-Kuhnian move of pragmatism.
Excellent. Thanks for the recommendations. I will admit Kuhn absolutely enriched our understanding of the history of science. But where I think people kind of get lost and end up with a very misguided understanding of the history of science after reading Kuhn is this idea that there is no movement toward truth in the history of science whatsoever. The idea of shifting between incommensurable scientific paradigms does work in some cases. It works when humanity discovers truly revolutionary facts about how the world works, truly disruptive insights about the physical laws of the universe. So when humanity discovers that the Earth is not the center of the universe, that's irreconcilable with all of our previous cosmology. Or when physicists of the early 20th century discover that space and time can bend in the presence of gravity, that's irreconcilable with Newtonian physics. But none of this is to say that we may shift back to believing someday that the Earth is the center of the universe again, just because it's convenient for solving a new set of scientific puzzles. We're never going to shift away from understanding matter in terms of subatomic particles, like protons and neutrons and electrons again, even though our understanding of matter itself might change dramatically. So these fundamental truths about the world, this low-hanging fruit about how the world works, these things are kind of now built into the project of science permanently. So Kuhn helped us see how the history of science can be very messy at times, just like the history of democracy. And the closer you are to the process, the fuzzier the line of progress might look. But the more you zoom out and look at the whole history of science, I think it's fair to say the more you see that these basic facts about how the world works are mile markers in a larger trajectory of our scientific understanding of what is true. So circling back to the pragmatists like Dewey and Rorty, I think that they're running away with these ideas that are derived from Darwin and Thomas Kuhn, that reality is fundamentally characterized by change, not stability, and therefore all truth is provisional. And so the best we can really ever hope for is to try to establish harmonious consensus. I think that that's wrong, and at least on some level, it just strikes me more as a semantic squabble, because I'm not sure what the difference is between intersubjective truth and objective truth, assuming we're talking about scientific truth claims. If all witnesses to a particular experimental phenomenon interpret the event in the same way, that convergence of subjective impression everyone agreeing that something is true or that something happened in a particular way is one of the best ways we have for establishing objective truth.
Well, the difference, in the practicable difference may not be significant, and that is perhaps something to emphasize. But the intellectual difference is not insignificant. So intersubjective truth still says, at the end of the day, truth is something that human beings call it. So it is a much more, in a certain sense, much more humble, much more down to earth, much more human focused. Human beings create truth. So intersubjective means what we collectively are going to call truth. Objective truth is an insistence that what is true is outside of what it means to be human being. It is indifferent to us. We could all go away and that truth stays. And what I think you have thinkers like Rorty and others in his tradition saying is that's either not true or it's not useful to even think that way. What is more useful is to think about truth as something that human beings negotiate with one another as they try to make their way in the world with one another. One thing I think is important, and here William James is particularly helpful, is that James, and he says this in Pragmatism, his book from 1907. But it's a very big book, and I would be hard pressed to tell your readers what page it's on. He says, but it's actually a very famous quote, so it's something that people shouldn't have a hard time finding by just rooting around on Google. And that is, he said, it's amazing, and I'm paraphrasing here, how many of our philosophical or ethical, intellectual, if you will, debates fade into utter insignificance when we ask, does it really matter? And so what you talked, and the reason I say this, Brad, is because you talked about like the semantics of it, and James would totally agree with you. He said that he's super funny. He says so much of what has passed for philosophical dispute in Western history really amounts to intellectual gymnastics. It's the semantic squabbles over this or that. And he says, ultimately, if you just ask the question, really? Again, I'm paraphrasing, but it's, really? And what difference does it make, if it's X or Y, if it's A or B, if it's Jack or if it's Jill? He says the vast majority of things that we argue over fade into utter insignificance when you simply ask the question, really? Does this really matter? And so, and I just want to put that in here because there's so much if we take that Jamesian move and we agree with him, then many of the conversations that we have about, is truth objective? Is it not objective? Is it intersubjective? And we think about the consequences of that contestation. Some of it may fade into insignificant. We relegate that to intellectual gymnastics. You can do that on a beanbag, in your dorm room, or as you said, by a campfire if you're John Dewey. Like, it's fun intellectually, as an intellectual practice to kind of like think it through, but really it's of no consequence. So what James is interested in, and he's got certain criteria of what these debates, what our intellectual contestations need to have in order to be consequential, urgent, that the outcome, that there's a real genuine difference in the outcome depending on how you answer that question. So anyway, I just invite that because I think at the very least it gets really rid of some of the silly season, that can come out of the caricatured version of pragmatists, woo, anything goes, and it's like, no, that's not really it. I would also just add one more thing that's important. One of the ways that you could look at the origins of pragmatism, or what one of the central concerns that James was struggling with, and here again, I think it might come closer to home for some of your listeners. I know it does for me personally, and I know it does for my students, is that James was in the late 19th century wrestling with the contested authority between religion and science. And it was, for him, an inner civil war. whether the truth of science undermined a faith in God, or whether, believing in God would make some of the discoveries of science disqualify them. And I mean, we can just historically look at the late 19th century as a period in which the tension between religious commitments and scientific commitments, or the authority of religion and science, is really fever hot. And again, it's not that it's gone away, but it's, it's one of those things that can kind of have hotter moments and cooler moments. Well, the late 19th century is a moment when the authority between religion and science is really very, very intense. And for a serious thinker like William James, it was talk about something that was of consequence. He was suicidal for stretches over this because he wanted to know what was true. The religious faith. He inherited a strange religious faith from his father, but Swedenborgianism, that's another conversation. But, this sort of the ineluctable appeal of believing in God and the religious traditions that flow out of that versus the scientific truth that's being produced, in the lab, in the field, among scientific experts. And so for James, pragmatism was a way to find peace between those two, was to try to say, what happens if we don't stop trying to grant which of these ways of being in the world, or which of these claims is right, and try to think about what the consequences of subscribing to one or the other, or gerrymandering your way through both of them might be, in terms of the practical consequences for the way that we live. And, this is sort of pragmatism at its best, trying to negotiate the competing authority between religion and science. One is a text he wrote in the late 19th century called The Will to Believe. So, again, it's not how you demonstrate that your faith tradition is right, but you can still choose to believe why it matters, or why you choose that faith, even if you can't make claims for its rightness. And it's a very, very powerful text. That's Will to Believe. And then the other one is from 1902 or 03, and that's The Varieties of Religious Experience. That's a longer text. That's a book. And here he tries to write about what happens if we stop trying to battle with one another about whose religious truth is right or wrong. What if we shift the conversation and look at experience? What are the different experiences that different religious traditions or commitments can yield? And how might that be a register of what is provisionally true? So I just throw these out as texts that are both they're really accessible, and they also show his humor. And again, they're texts to wrestle with and argue with and disagree with, but they're kind of pragmatism at their best, and dealing with issues of absolute urgency for many of us, right? Which is wrestling with belief in God or different faith traditions. So anyways, I just wanted to tuck that in here.
That's great. And to bring it full circle with our opening conversation about the context of ideas, I think that it's very understandable that in the context of the late 19th century in America and in Europe, where society was wrestling with such disruption, industrial and scientific disruption of long-held ideas about meaning and God through collisions with evolution and the theory of relativity and other remarkable new ideas, it makes sense that a lot of these thinkers were struggling to reconcile these different claims to truth. I think that in our own time, the liability of abandoning or even rejecting or castigating the notion of objective truth can lead to disaster. I mean, it can lead to something as humorous as raw water enthusiasm, which is hard to believe until you look at the data of how many people advocate drinking unfiltered, unpurified water for its apparent health benefits, to something more serious like anti-vaccination propaganda that threatens not only people who decide not to be vaccinated, but the herd immunity of everybody, and can produce terrible and unnecessary suffering and death, to contestations in universities about what questions belong in the realm of science and what questions belong in the realm of culture and politics. And that kind of confusion muddies the waters on all kinds of really important issues. So I think conversations like this are incredibly important, not to mention incredibly interesting. It's clear the pragmatists were at least trying to create a philosophical project that would reconcile America's diversity with a common sense of truth and meaning and vision for how to live together. And if that's not a universal, objective, timeless good, I'm not sure what is. So I really appreciate, Jennifer, everything I've learned from you in this conversation.
Well, thank you. And let me say, I think the way that you put it is very resonant for me. It's really powerful, Brad. And here I would say there are two responses, because you're right. We live in perilous times, post-truth, right? Alternative facts, anti-vaxxers, lots of ideas out there that have that many people, many of us would agree have very bad consequences. And we want to be able to respond to them. We want to be able to say they're wrong. And the question is, how can you do that? And what I would do is to do a little combination between history and pragmatism here. And I would say context and consequence. So that is what we can do with claims that strike us as fraught and perilous and deleterious is to look first and expose the context in which they are produced. What is the conditions that is making this claim possible? What are the conditions that so many people are finding it attractive? That's called, being a rigorous inquirer in whatever form. So the context of those claims really matter. We need to know where they're coming from. But we also need to look at the consequences of claims, and we need to think about those. So where ideas land, where do they get us by making certain claims? And there I think that this is the work of, this has always been the work of intellectuals, but this is the work of your listeners today. I would say if objectivity is an idea that is useful to them to push back against ideas that they think are perilous, that's fine. If it's a useful idea, wonderful. But what I wanted to simply offer is that historically there have been very interesting thinkers who have thought one way to approach ideas that are controversial and potentially problematic is first to do the work of putting them in context, understanding where they come from, and then exploring the consequences of those ideas. If the consequences are not great, in a Jamesian move, then we can get over it. It's a silly idea. It's not of any consequence. We just ignore it. We'll agree to disagree. Or the consequence is perhaps more wide scale, more momentous, and then it's our job to explain why.
Well, this has all been very helpful, and thank you so much again, Jennifer, for coming back on Context and talking with me about some of these ideas. We're sort of right in the middle of a phase on the show where, we're digging into humanity's historical relationship to truth and to facts. Actually, in the next episode on the show, I'm planning to cover a book called Leviathan and the Air Pump by historians of science Stephen Shapin and Simon Schaffer, which did an incredible job of analyzing the historical origin of the idea of a fact. I mean, we take this concept of facts so much for granted in the modern world. It's like a building block of our understanding of reality, and we become righteously indignant when people manipulate or try to manipulate facts. And this book, Leviathan and the Air Pump, looks at the origin of the concept of facts as we now know it and how contentious that origin really was. So I'm extremely excited to cover that book in the next episode, given how bizarrely divided America seems to be becoming over the status of facts. And this conversation with you was such an important step in illuminating our historical relationship to truth more broadly. So, Jennifer Ratner-Rosenhagen, again, thank you so much for coming back on Context. I will provide links in the show notes directing to the Amazon pages for your two books, American Nietzsche and The Ideas That Made America. Highly recommend both. But are there any other places where people can find your work?
Oh, goodness. I have someone working on a website for me. I had an old one and we pulled it down because I thought it was time to update it. So perhaps by the time this is launched, I'll also have a website which will link my other shorter essays or some of my talks, which are online. There are quite a number of them on YouTube. But if not, I'm happy to let my book on Nietzsche or my book on the sweep of American thought do the ambassadorial work of sharing my views of things and my work. So thank you.
Thank you again, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, and take care.